Joining us to talk about his new book, The Crisis of Zionism, is Peter Beinart. Peter, of course, is the Associate Professor of Journalism and Political Science at City University of New York. He's a senior political writer for the Daily Beasts, and which is, I guess, now also Newsweek. He's also the New America Foundation. And Peter, of course, has caused a lot of controversy in the United States by suggesting that perhaps it's not in Israel's best interest to continue to militarily occupy some 500,000 Palestinians. Shocking. Peter, thanks for joining us on Aslan Media.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, listen, a lot's already been written about your book, so I think what I'd like to do is just kind of push ahead from your book and ask you just this very simple question. Do you think that it's just too late? I mean, the idea that the occupation is detrimental to Israel's long-term survival, if you don't believe that, you're lying to yourself. So that's kind of an established fact. But the suggestion seems to be that somehow we can convince Israel to extricate itself from the West Bank rather than what it's doing now, which is accelerating the occupation. So, is it too late?
That's the question that kind of keeps me up at night and is a big part of the reason I wrote the book. It's funny, it can look very different from different perspectives. On the one hand, you look at, the very large number of settlements, including illegal outposts that have been built throughout the West Bank and that are being, and with settlement growth increasing very quickly, and you say, as many people look on the ground and they say, this is one state between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, and the egg cannot be unscrambled. You have, in the American Jewish conversation, people usually tend to talk about kind of remote outposts deep in the West Bank versus kind of established large cities right on the Green Line. But the problem with that rhetoric is that you have places like Ariel, which is the fourth largest settlement, 20,000 people, stretches 13 miles into the West Bank and really does serious damage to the contiguity of the Palestinian state. So I understand why that leads people to pessimism. On the other hand, in late 2008, according to the testimony of both Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas, they were fairly close to a deal. And Abbas has said we were very close, and he urged Benjamin Netanyahu to continue those negotiations. And I think that some of the Palestinian leaders also think they could have gotten a deal in relatively short order. Now, getting a deal and actually implementing it are two whole separate questions. But even as things on the ground have gotten worse and worse and worse, actually, funnily enough, in the negotiating process, at least up until this Israeli government, I actually think you saw a movement of coming together. There were some reports that the Palestinians were down to as low as demanding 150,000 refugee return. I mean, if that was really their position, then I think you could see the outlines of a deal. Probably not at 150,000, but at lower than that. But it's essentially within the realm of being of worth talking about.
Well, of course, we have been close a lot. I mean, we were close with Rabin, we were close with Barak, we were close with Sharon, we were close with Olmert. We've been close a lot, and it just seems that, it's never actually happened. And you did say, until this government, and you're right, this government, I think, has been disastrous for peace, probably the worst government that Israel has had when it comes to the possibility of achieving a two-state solution. And yet, as far as I can understand the polls in Israel, this government still enjoys enormous support for its position, and particularly amongst, and this is, I think, probably the worst news of all, amongst young Israelis. I keep seeing poll after poll after poll of Israeli high school students who are espousing certain views that are just absolutely shocking and depressing when you think about that this could be the future of the country.
I think there are a couple of things that are going on. First is demographic change with the modern and ultra-Orthodox communities growing and significantly further to the right. The other is the impact of the Russian immigration of the 1990s, with the population that has been very good for Israel in some ways, very economically productive, but quite to the right, and somewhat even authoritarian in their political views. And the other thing is the lingering impact of the Second Intifada and the Gaza disengagement.
Mm-hmm.
I spend a fair amount of time in books trying to argue that I think the causes of the Second Intifada, the failure of the Oslo process, and the dynamic that happened with Israel's dismantling of settlements from Gaza, that there is blame on both sides, and it's a multi-causal explanation for why these things went so tragically wrong. But in the Israeli political narrative, there's a very strong consensus, I would say, that basically Israel made a good faith effort to try to get rid of the West Bank, and they were met with this terror war of the Second Intifada, which was incredibly traumatic for Israelis. Now, of course, it was incredibly traumatic for Palestinians too, but for Israelis, the randomness of the suicide bombings really had a very profound impact on the society. And unfortunately, this really has devastated the Israeli left. Now, I mean, the only hope in some ways one has now in Israel, because the left is so weak, is that you can have people from the right, like Olmert, who is a longtime member of Likud, who can basically see the writing on the wall and recognize they have to change their point of view. But when you have a political leader like Benjamin Netanyahu, who I think either doesn't really believe that, or basically just finds it more politically comfortable to stay within his right-wing coalition, then unfortunately there's very little challenge that the left is able to mount politically.
Last question. Israel is becoming increasingly isolated internationally. The actions of this government have really alienated even some of Israel's closest allies and friends in Europe and in the United States. Polls in the U.S. show that at least amongst those who are under 40, there is increasing parity in the acceptance of both the Israeli and the Palestinian narrative. The old days of Israel, right or wrong, seem to be moving behind us. That, of course, by some estimates, spells disaster for Israel. I mean, if its closest ally, its closest friend, is starting to have doubts about that friendship, that's not a good thing. But I guess the question that I have for you is, not counting the Israeli political establishment, focusing here on the United States, who's at fault for this? I mean, who do you blame the most for the way in which the United States has, over these past years, sheltered the Israeli government, successive Israeli governments, from making the difficult choices necessary to preserve its own survival?
Well, I would make a very clear distinction between American support for Israeli security and American support for Israel's increased settlement in the West Bank. I think it's actually very important for the United States to help Israel with things like the Arrow and Iron Dome anti-missile defense systems. And I, as a supporter of the existence of the State of Israel and as a Zionist, I want the United States to help Israel maintain its military advantage in the region. But I think Israel, that is very different than the U.S. supporting, or at least condoning, the process of settlement growth in the West Bank, which virtually all of the former leaders of Israel's own security agencies and former heads of the Israeli Defense Forces have said is bad for Israeli security because essentially it invites the Palestinians into a one-state struggle that will make it impossible for Israel to continue to exist as a democratic Jewish state. And so I think the U.S. has to find a way of both reassuring Israel that America still cares deeply and will support Israel's security, while distinguishing that from the settlement growth, which is not good for Israel's own security. And I don't think one of the difficult things about Israeli politics is that even more left-of-center governments like Rabin's, especially Barak's, have had enormous difficulty in getting a handle on settlement growth, because the ministries that deal with settlement growth are really under the control at this point of settlers and pro-settler groups. And it's essentially not something that the Israeli Prime Minister has, the Israeli Prime Ministers have been able to get a handle on. And I think that the United States government in some ways has to help give Israeli Prime Ministers the political cover to say, well, you know what, we have to take on this issue because the United States is really forcing us to take on this issue. I think that actually might help an Israeli Prime Minister who wanted to take the tough steps that they would need to.
Right. No,
even if you didn't believe that there should be a Palestinian state tomorrow, even if you wanted the Israeli Defense Forces in the West Bank to protect against terrorism, it would still be incredibly stupid to subsidize civilians, Israelis, to continue to move to the West Bank. They provide no security whatsoever, and all they do is they make Palestinians believe that there will never be a Palestinian state.
Well, the thing that I'm sort of worried about is this disturbing change that I've started to notice, especially my last trip to Israel. Those shirts that are being sold in the old city that say "Don't worry, America, we've got your back." And then there's a picture of some sort of F-15 fighter which we built in the United States and gave to Israel. And I feel like there's this weird shift taking place where, far from the United States being the sort of the protector, the dominant force in that relationship, it's weirdly starting to shift. And even among the Israeli populace, there's this idea that somehow, Israel wears the pants, to put it in its sexist way. I don't know if you have any last thoughts on that.
Well, those T-shirts have been around a long time. I remember seeing them when I was a kid in the old city as well. I don't think that's the view amongst most Israelis. I do think that this Israeli government, I think, is perhaps doesn't recognize that while in Congress there's still virtually unanimous support for supporting the policies of the Israeli government, that there is more discomfort out there in the American public, and I think it comes in different forms. Some of it is people, including many liberal American Jews, who are uncomfortable about morally with some of Israel's policies. Some of it is just isolationism. You see in the kind of the Ron Paul campaign of people saying, we want out of the Middle East, and Israel keeps somehow keeping us involved in a place that we don't want to be involved in. Obviously, military action in Iran against could fuel that. I want a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, but I want a strong U.S.-Israel relationship that preserves Israeli democracy and gives Palestinians the rights and dignity of statehood. And I fear that, in fact, that relationship could be, as you suggested, eroding a little bit more under the surface than some in the Israeli government seem to recognize.
Peter Beinart, the book is called The Crisis of Zionism. It is proudly our May Book of the Month Club for Aslan Media. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.